All right, so today we're doing a deep dive on something that I think a lot of people have on their minds, especially if you're thinking about getting one of the new iPhones, the iPhone 16, the 16 plus the 16 Pro or the Pro Max, and that is RF exposure.
Yeah, it's one of those things that, you hear about, but you don't always really know, like, what it all means.
Right, exactly. And we have all the official documentation right here from Apple, and we're going to try to make sense of this for you. Like, what does it mean for these specific phones? How is it measured? And what do those numbers actually mean, for you, like when you're using your phone every day?
Yeah, we're going to be going through Apple's RF exposure information for each of these phones.
Okay, so let's start with the basics. RF exposure, what are we even talking about here?
So talking about radio frequency energy, and that's the energy that your iPhone and every cell phone uses to communicate,
Yeah.
with cell towers, with Wi-Fi, all of that.
Right, so it's like the invisible waves that connect everything.
Exactly. And so radio frequency energy is a form of electromagnetic radiation.
Mm-hmm.
And whenever you have that, you have the potential for exposure. And so the way we measure that exposure is something called the specific absorption rate, or SAR.
Okay, SAR. So that's the number that we see in the documentation.
That's right.
And I noticed there's a couple of different limits mentioned, like 1.6 watts per kilogram and 2 watts per kilogram. Why are there two different numbers there?
Yeah, that's because there are different regulatory standards around the world.
Hmm.
So the 1.6 W kg limit, that's what's used in the U.S. and a lot of other countries, and that's averaged over 1 gram of tissue. And then the 2 W kg limit that's used in Europe and some other countries, and that's averaged over 10 grams of tissue.
Got it. Okay. And I guess the important thing is these iPhones are all within those limits, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
So Apple has tested all 4 of these iPhone 16 models, and they all comply with those limits in the regions where they're sold.
Okay, good to know. So how do they actually test this stuff? I mean, like, how do they figure out the SAR?
Yeah, so in the lab, they basically set the iPhone to transmit at its highest possible power level.
Yeah.
So it's like the worst case scenario. And then they use equipment to measure the SAR in real time. And they do that over specific periods of time.
Okay, so they're really pushing these phones to the limit in the lab.
Exactly.
And so how do they simulate, like how we actually use our phones?
Yeah, so they test it in positions that are similar to how we use it. So, holding it up to your head like you're making a phone call.
Right.
And then also they test it when it's close to the body, like in your pocket or on your belt. And they usually have a separation of like 5 millimeters.
Oh, okay, so they take that into account.
Yeah, so they take into account that you're not like, pressed right up against it usually.
Right, right, okay. And I saw in the documentation it mentioned something about Apple using like industry-approved regulatory methods. What does that mean?
So that basically means they're following all the procedures and the best practices that regulatory agencies all over the world have, developed to make sure that these phones comply with those limits.
So it's not just like Apple making up their own tests.
Right.
It's like a standardized thing.
Yeah, and what's really interesting is that the iPhone actually monitors its own radio usage and manages its power in real time to make sure that it stays within those limits.
Oh, wow. So it's not even just like a one-time test. It's like constantly checking.
Yeah, it's always making sure it's safe.
That's pretty cool. Okay, so let's get to the numbers then. Let's start with the iPhone 16 Plus, and we'll go through all of them. What are the SAR values for that one?
Okay, so for the iPhone 16 Plus, that includes models A382, A38289, A32290, and A3291. The SAR values for the 1.6 W kg limit are 1.13 for the head and 1.16 for the body. And then for the 2 W kg limit, it's 1.24 for the head and 1.33 for the body.
Right, so those are for the
Yeah.
But what about the Pro Max?
For the Pro Max, that's models A3084, A3295, A3296, and A3297 for the 1.6 W kg limit. It's 1.01 for the head and 1.15 for the body. And then for the 2 W kgs limit, it's 1.22 for the head and 1.45 for the body.
Okay, so a little bit lower on the head for the Pro Max.
Yeah, for the 1.6 limit.
Okay, what about the 16 Pro?
The 16 Pro, that's models A3083, A3292, A3293, and A3294. The 1.6 W kg limit is 1.09 for the head, 1.19 for the body, and then the 2 W kg limit is 1.24 for the head and 1.48 for the body.
Okay, and last but not least, the regular iPhone 16.
Yeah, so for the regular iPhone 16 models, A3081, A3286, A3287, and A3288, under the 1.6 W kg limit, the head SAR is 1.08, and the body is 1.27, and then the 2 W kg limit, the head is 1.24, and the body is 1.41.
Wow. Okay, so I'm looking at all these numbers, and they're all pretty similar. Like, they're all well below the limits.
Yeah, it's really interesting to see how consistent they are across all the models. There's some slight variation, but they're all really close, which kind of shows that Apple has a pretty consistent approach to managing the RF exposure.
Yeah. That's good to know. So they all meet the standards, and that's great. But I also noticed in the documentation, there's some recommendations for people who, maybe want to be extra cautious about RF exposure.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the main recommendations is to use hands-free options as much as possible. So that's like speakerphone or headphones or, Bluetooth headsets.
All right, so just get the phone away from your head a little bit.
Exactly, because that's going to reduce the amount of RF energy that you're exposed to.
Makes sense. And there's also a warning about cases that have metal parts. What's up with that?
Yeah, so metal can interfere with the antennas in the iPhone, and that can change the way the phone transmits and receives radio signals.
Yeah.
And so if that happens, it might not comply with the RF exposure guidelines anymore because it was tested without the case.
Oh, so it's like the case could mess things up.
Right.
Yeah. That's good to know. Okay, one last thing I saw in the documentation, they mentioned that the availability of specific radio bands can differ depending on your carrier. And if you're roaming, what does that have to do with all of this?
Yeah, so basically Apple tests the iPhones on all the bands that it can operate on, but which band you're actually using, that depends on your carrier and where you are and the roaming agreements and stuff. But that doesn't really change the SAR compliance because the testing is done at the maximum power output for all the bands. So it's more of a factor for like your network connectivity and data speeds.
Oh, okay, I get it. So the SAR is like the worst case scenario no matter what band you're using.
Exactly.
Okay, well, I think that covers it. So to sum it all up, what would you say is like the key takeaway about RF exposure and these iPhone 16s?
I think the main takeaway is that all four models have been thoroughly tested and they meet all the safety standards for RF exposure, and the SAR values are all well within those limits.
And just to remind everyone, SAR stands for specific absorption rate, and it's a measure of how much radio frequency energy your body absorbs from your phone.
Exactly.
Okay, well, there you have it. That was our deep dive on RF exposure for the iPhone 16 family. We looked at what it is, how it's measured, the specific numbers for each phone, and some tips for, if you're concerned about it. So hopefully you're feeling a little bit more informed now.
And, this whole thing about the iPhone constantly monitoring and adjusting its RF exposure, it really makes you think about the technology that's going into these phones and, what kind of innovations and safety measures are going to come to, like, it's pretty amazing that it can do all of that automatically.
Yeah, it really is. Like, we don't even think about it, but it's happening all the time.
Exactly. It's just one of those things that just works behind the scenes, but there's a lot of complexity there.
Yeah. Well, hopefully this deep dive has given you a little peek behind the curtain and made you think about some of the bigger questions around mobile technology and, where it's all headed.
Definitely. And maybe it'll even inspire some people to, dig a little deeper and learn more about all the intricacies of these devices.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive, and we'll see you next time.
See you next time.